Justin?
It's even gone even further to the fact that, one upon a time only men could go shirtless or so on, and now there's the whole, the Free the Tauntauns movement, and several cities have adopted it. No, seriously, they've adopted the fact that if men can walk around with their shirts off, then so can women, and that's just is what it is. There's no problem. It's in New York right now.
It came up at the U.S. Open, it was so hot down there, a lot of those fellas after the first or second set would take their shirt off and change to another one, and they did it right out in public. There was a lady who did it. She had on a sports bra. I mean, she wasn't displaying anything. Sopping wet shirt, took it off, and she was reprimanded for it. After the U.S. Open, they went back and reviewed that rule and said, we have to have a leveler play. If you're going to let guys be shirtless to change, then what's your problem with a woman at least is covered in a sports bra to change her shirt so she's got a drier attire on?
And then to add on to what he was saying, I found this out recently. There's parts of San Francisco where public nudity is completely legal. Completely legal.
Well, and there's nude beaches in Hudson, right? Is it Hudson or Arapika? So, there's values that are accommodated, even though they're not universalized.
To add on to that, a lot of people may not know Florida is, I think, currently the third or fourth largest per capita in the entire United States for nudist resorts.
Say again?
The old people just got done wearing clothes.
Let them just whatever. No, I spent time in Mexico, and in very southern Mexico, there's a big industrial commercial city called Villahermosa in a state called Tabasco, and they passed a law you couldn't walk around nude in your house. And when I heard that, I thought, say what? Well, because what happened down there, so we're used to certain accommodations that they don't have. We have AC. Okay? Down there they don't. It's just too expensive. You go to Santiago, Chile, you're going to freeze in the winter because they cannot afford heat. You get boiling water, you put it in the bathtub, it's porcelain. You got 5 minutes and then you're going to be encased in ice. You don't have a choice. And it would be best not to get up in the middle of the night and stumble to the bathroom and sit down on a porcelain toilet because it's going to be whatever the temperature is outside anyway. So in Villahermosa, they had very few AC, and what happened then is the people would open the windows and the air would go through, and that's how they cool themselves. And if you walk by the window, people were offended at seeing your nudity, and so they passed a law that you couldn't walk around. Right, and we go, really? That's exactly what Gensler's talking about. The problem with absolutism is most of us have gathered our moral values from culture. Nothing wrong with that. We have cultural values. You're born into a culture. I know a fellow who was a Christian missionary, went to Africa, met a tribe, and it was an odd kind of tribe. The women all walked around without shirts, and the prostitutes walked around with shirts. And it was like, okay. And it was like, oh, no. There was kind of a biblical expression for it. It's kind of the forbidden fruit, And so the women did away with that. I mean, they were okay. Everybody was shirtless, but the prostitutes had shirts on. So when they brought their message, they tried to get the women who weren't prostitutes to cover up. And they said, well, why do you want to turn us into prostitutes? And they just couldn't cross that divide because those were the cultural values that had been engendered in them. It would be the same thing if someone came here and said everybody has to now dress up, from here to there. Everybody needs a haircut, everybody needs this, and we go, well, it wasn't that long ago we did that. It wasn't long ago you didn't dare go outside the bonds of what culture said. Look, we'll discover in 1967 there were, I think, 16 states you couldn't marry across cultural lines. Not just African American and Caucasian, but Hispanic, Latin, and what we call native or indigenous people. And it went beyond that. If you were Italian, you better marry an Italian. If you were Jewish, you better marry Jewish. If you were Irish, you better marry. I mean, it just these mores were. When I say mores, I mean moral values. They were this tight. You literally went through life this way, and if you didn't, you were castigated. There are families who you never talked to the family again. They threw you out. And now we've made an adjustment. We're trying to accommodate more. It's called libertarian political. We're trying to accommodate more. There are limitations to this. We'll get to this as we get into libertarian sexual morality next week. We still don't have a problem with circumcision of males. It's up to the family now. The hospitals can't automatically do it. But removal of a woman's clitoris. And yet there are cultures that require that to protect their women from sexual indiscretions. We look at that and go, and I'll give you some examples of this. I don't want to get too technical with it, but this is the differences then between culture to culture. Gensler's right. We're born into cultural values. What happens, and he objects to then, is we say, well, these are the absolute values and everybody ought to follow them. Well, that doesn't always hold. How many of you want to give up your right hand if you steal something? Or if you're in Germany and you get busted driving, you lose your license for life. This is back in 72, 74 when I was here. If you were in an accident and killed someone, you went to prison for life. I mean, we look at that and shake our head and say, well, you know, really? Isn't that extreme? Not in Germany. Not in many places where they cut your hand off. Where they have revolutions and you don't join their side, they'll cut your arm off. You'll never raise your hand against that group of people again. Even if they end up being terminated and someone else replaces them. That's a moral value. Go ahead.
This is a true story. Over during my military time over in Iraq there, we were over there in the dead of summer, and summer temperatures over there can get up to 180 degrees out in the sun. And the men, well, from the American side, they were allowed to wear tank tops and shorts, and it was okay. But us females, we had to completely cover ourselves. Even though we were American, we had to completely cover ourselves. And then we weren't, even as females, we weren't allowed to do certain activities, let's say that the American males were doing, you know? Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. My thing is, if I'm part of America and it's okay if the males from America are able to do this because it's acceptable there, well, in America, women walking around in tank tops and shorts is okay. So my thing is, why couldn't I, as an American female, do exactly what my American males are doing?
Sure.
Well, what if nudity was okay in their country and they came here and it was just like, and you'd be like, oh, I'm offended.
But they can do that.
One hand up. But there's other mores that they have that we don't allow them to do over here, like
Right.
clitoral castrate. You can't do that here. That's mutilation. It's called clitoral mutilation. You can't do that. I don't care what your religion says. Of course, the other argument is your First Amendment says you have religious freedom. If your religion requires that, how can you say I can't do that if you really support religious freedom? Well, then we decide what we're really supporting is the common religion that we believe in. But now we're a pluralistic society. Many societies are what we call homogeneous. They're self-enclosed. And so they live with that. Women are dressed from here to here, and they may not be happy with it, but those are the mores, and they end up living with it. We're a pluralistic society where people bring different values with them, and we're trying to figure out, so how does this all fit together when they seem quite contrary or in opposition to one another? And this is exactly Gensler's point. What's right and what's wrong? What's good and what's bad? For one culture, yes, it works. For another culture, not necessarily. Now, he makes the misassumption that there's some common agreement that you come to. That's true only in certain cases, people. And I want to show you this because you're gonna see this on your quiz. And you have to know this is what he says. He says, in your culture, you can't disagree. Well, that depends. There are some cultures that believe in relative objective or relative values where you can't disagree. They're called totalitarian cultures that are culturally absolute. Their rules are the rules. They treat them as if they're universal, objective, and absolute. And you don't dare object to them. You run into problems. Maybe the culture that you're referring to. A culture that does not allow for disagreement assumes that their values are absolute. If you go to a culture that's more democratic in a sense, where we can make adjustments to the values, we realize that there is wide support, but we can change those. We can be critical. That's how change occurs. This is how I tried to end the lecture on Monday. The moral conscience requires that we object to values and laws that we think are unfair and change them and bring them more into alignment with where the common good would be. So women have the right to vote. slaves are no longer property. And we go through this whole change of values, and it can only happen in a democratic society. So some of the assumptions he makes, that you can't be contradictory, you can't criticize your culture, are true only in certain circumstances, and he does not allow that. Do you understand what I just said to you? There is room for criticism in certain societies. In other societies, not. These societies are treating their values as if they're universal, objective, and absolute. But they're just their values. That's different than a culture that has found moral realism, that has found true objective values. Much different, but they treat each other the same way. So you have to see that difference. Gensler is saying, in a relative society, you can't be critical. True only if you understand the type of society he's referring to, a totalitarian society where there's no room for criticism. In a democratic society, that's how we change law. We're critical of how things have been, and we make adjustments to it. So do you understand that part to it? Honestly, how many of you don't? So I can clarify, because you're going to see this, people, on your quiz. You have to understand the difference. So what he's saying is, he's making an assumption that in your culture you can't criticize your values. That's true in certain cultures. But he then tags that, let me come back to here. He says, on the one hand, I'm a relativist, says cultural relativism gives us a basis for common morality within a culture, a democratic basis that pools everyone's ideas and ensures that the values have wide support. Where do you get wide support amongst the people in a society? In a totalitarian society or in a democratic society? Democratic. He acknowledges that the values need to have wide support, but then he says you can't be critical of it. And the mistake he makes philosophically is to equate democratic societies with totalitarian societies. He's never going to bring that up. I bring that up. I want you to understand the difference. In philosophy, we have to be able to examine ideas and see the upside and the downside. So his comments about relativism is right. Cultures are relativistic. We come to our own values. Sometimes we come to objective values and sometimes we don't. But there are values. Some cultures allow for criticism and some don't. So his argument falls down a tad. Let me go on to some of the more. So he's got objections to cultural relativism. Some of these are valuable and some of them are wrong. Cultural relativism forces us to conform to society's norms or else we contradict ourselves. Only in a totalitarian point of view. In a democratic point of view, we can contradict ourselves. We can change the law. If cultural relativism were true, then we couldn't consistently disagree with the values of our society. Once again, this is in position to the totalitarian versus the democratic. Ima could bite the bullet and say that it's self-contradictory to disagree morally with the majority. No, it isn't. If you have a different point of view and you're in a system where you can voice it and you can maybe change, sway opinion, you put your hand on the moral compass of the law, you can change the values of society. So we go from prohibition to now we can drink. Marijuana is a Class A drug. Did you hear Coke is now thinking of introducing THC into its drink because it's a mild sedative that deals with pain, and they're going to get you all stoned on Coke. You're just going to feel really cool, and you're going to have to decide whether you want to eat munchies all day or not.
Sorry, I have to correct you.
It's okay.
Not cannabinoids, not THC.
Say what?
Cannabinoids, CBD.